The silence in Claudia's home was a physical weight, heavier than the mahogany furniture that filled her hollowed-out living room. It was 6 a.m. and she was already awake, her hands encased in yellow rubber gloves, scrubbing a marble countertop that had no business being cleaned for the third time this week. Before we begin this journey of redemption, tell us, have you ever judged someone based on a single moment, only to find out they were fighting a battle you knew nothing about? Let us know in the comments below. Claudia's jaw was perpetually set, a rigid line of defiance against a world that had taken everything but her dignity. 2 years ago her husband Robert had walked out the door for a business trip and simply never came back, not to her and not to this life. He had started a new family in a different state, leaving Claudia with a mortgage she couldn't afford and a reputation as the perfect wife that felt like a noose. She didn't cry anymore, she cleaned. She didn't mourn, she corrected. She walked to the window, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a neighbor's dog stepping onto the edge of her perfectly manicured lawn. Her pulse quickened. It wasn't about the dog, it was about the infraction. It was about the rules. If the rules failed, the world dissolved into chaos, and Claudia could not survive any more chaos. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly, ready to call the homeowners association. Control was the only thing keeping her bones from turning to dust. 3 miles away, Julian sat in a room that smelled of dust, rain, and vanilla tobacco. The morning light filtered through the grime of his studio windows, illuminating rows of vintage cameras and half-edited reels of film. He was 34, but his eyes carried the exhaustion of a man double that age. He was currently staring at a frame of a young girl laughing in a rainstorm, a shot from a documentary he had been working on for 3 years. Julian's sister, Maya, had been the light of his life until a meningococcal infection took her in 48 hours. Since then Julian had become a ghost. He didn't participate in life, he documented it. He found safety in the lens. Behind the glass he was untouchable. He could zoom in on beauty without ever having to feel its heat, and he could capture pain without letting it stain his own skin. He picked up his heavy DSLR, the weight of it familiar and comforting against his chest. Today he needed to capture the suburban pulse for a local heritage project. He grabbed his jacket, avoiding the mirror by the door. He didn't want to see the man who hadn't smiled in a photograph since 2019. The setting for their collision was Elmwood Park, a place of aggressive greenery and strictly enforced leisure. Claudia arrived first. She sat on a bench, her back as straight as a ruler, watching. She noticed every blade of grass out of place, every child screaming too loudly, every teenager with a skateboard. To the casual observer she looked like a woman of status and poise. But if you looked closer, if you looked through a lens, you could see the way her fingers clutched her designer handbag as if it were a life raft. Julian entered the park from the south end. He moved like a shadow, his camera held low. He wasn't looking for the big moments, he was looking for the subtext. He saw an old man feeding birds and captured the loneliness in the tilt of his hat. He saw a young couple arguing and captured the way their hands still sought each other out despite the harsh words. Then he saw her. Through his 85mm lens, Claudia didn't look like a Karen. She looked like a statue in a storm. He adjusted the focus, the blur of the park falling away until only she remained. He saw the way she checked her watch every 30 seconds. He saw the frantic rhythmic tapping of her foot. She's waiting for something to go wrong, Julian thought, his finger hovering over the shutter. She's waiting for a reason to let it out. At that moment, a young delivery rider on an e-bike zipped across the pedestrian-only path, nearly clipping the toes of Claudia's expensive loafers. The snap was audible. Not from the bike but from the woman. Claudia stood up, her face transforming from a mask of poise into a contorted map of rage. Hey, this is a walking path. Can you not read the signs? The rider, a boy no older than 19 with headphones around his neck, slowed down but didn't stop. Sorry lady. I'm on a clock. I don't care about your clock. Claudia screamed, her voice cracking, rising to a pitch that made the birds in the nearby oaks take flight. There are rules. There are laws. Do you think you're better than everyone else? Julian didn't turn away. He didn't put the camera down. He felt a surge of professional instinct but also a strange, heavy pull of empathy. He hit the record button. On the small digital screen, he saw Claudia move toward the boy, her finger pointing like a weapon. He saw the onlookers pulling out their own phones, their faces lighting up with the cruel excitement of someone about to witness a viral moment. But Julian saw something else. In the high-definition display, he saw a tear escape the corner of Claudia's eye even as she shrieked about proper etiquette and calling the police. It was a tear of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. She wasn't yelling at the boy. She was yelling at the husband who left. She was yelling at the God who allowed her life to vanish. She was yelling at the silence in her house. "I am a taxpayer," Claudia shrieked, her face inches from the bewildered boys. "I have a right to be safe. You are a menace. You are nothing." The boy finally hopped off his bike, getting defensive. "Get out of my face, crazy lady. Someone film this. Look at this Karen go." Julian watched through the viewfinder as a crowd gathered. He saw the mockery. He saw the way the world was already beginning to delete Claudia's humanity, turning her into a caricature, a meme, a 3-minute clip of unhinged behavior. He lowered his camera for a split second, his eyes meeting Claudia's across the distance. For a heartbeat, the rage in her eyes faltered. She saw him, not the camera but the man. She saw the pity in his expression, and for a woman like Claudia, pity was more painful than a slap. She turned back to the boy, her voice louder now, a desperate attempt to reclaim the anger because the alternative was falling apart right there on the grass. "You'll see," she cried out to the crowd, her voice trembling. "You'll all see what happens when you stop caring about the rules." Julian watched her storm away, her gait uneven, her perfect facade lying in pieces on the walking path. He looked down at his camera. He had it all. The outburst, the finger-pointing, the frantic, ugly side of a woman losing her mind. He knew that if he uploaded this, it would get millions of views. It would be the success his struggling studio needed. But as he watched Claudia's retreating figure, he felt the ghost of his sister Maya whispering in his ear. "Everyone is carrying something, Jules. Even the ones who scream." He didn't realize it then, but the Karen, who didn't realize the camera was rolling, had just captured his heart in a way no beautiful sunset ever could. The blue light of the computer monitor was the only thing illuminating Julian's studio, casting long, distorted shadows against the walls lined with the ghosts of his past work. It was 2 a.m. The world outside was silent, but inside the speakers, Claudia was screaming. Julian had the footage looped. He watched the way her jugular vein pulsed against her pale skin. He watched the way her hand, clutching that designer bag, shook with a rhythmic, violent tremor. He wasn't looking at the Karen the internet was already starting to feast upon. He was looking at the woman he had seen through the 85mm lens. We've all seen viral videos of people at their worst. But have you ever stopped to wonder what happened 5 minutes before the camera started rolling? Share your thoughts on cancel culture in the comments. He slowed the playback to 10% speed. In slow motion, the outburst lost its jagged edge and became something operatic, a silent cry of a person drowning in plain sight. At the 1:42 mark, right as she shrieked about the taxpayers' rights, the camera caught it, the light hitting a single heavy tear that didn't fall from anger, but from a reservoir of old, stagnant pain. Julian felt a sharp, familiar ache in his chest, the phantom limb of his grief for Maya. He knew that look. He had seen it in his own mirror every morning for 3 years. It was the look of someone who had realized that no matter how loud they screamed, the person they were screaming for wasn't coming back. "Why didn't you just stay home, Claudia?" Julian whispered to the screen. He had looked up her name from the tag on her bag he'd zoomed in on. Claudia Sterling. A simple search had revealed her life. The charity galas, the high society wedding, and then the sudden, quiet disappearance of her husband from all public records 18 months ago. Meanwhile, in the sprawling, cold house on the hill, Claudia sat on the floor of her walk-in closet. It was the only place in the house that didn't feel too big. The lights were off. Her phone sat 3 feet away on the hardwood, vibrating incessantly like a trapped insect. Bing, bing, bing. She didn't need to look at it. She knew. A friend, or someone she had thought was a friend, had sent a link 2 hours ago with a single sentence, "Claudia, tell me this isn't you." It was her. It was the version of her that Robert had always hated. The high-strung version, the difficult woman. The video, filmed by a teenager on a shaky iPhone, had already reached 500,000 views. The comments were a bloodbath. "Look at this entitled monster. Classic Karen. She needs to be fired. I hope she loses everything." Claudia pulled her knees to her chest. She wanted to feel the righteous anger she had felt in the park, but it was gone, replaced by a hollow, freezing vacuum. She had tried so hard to keep the edges of her life sharp and clean, believing that if she just followed the rules, if she just made everyone else follow them, the hole in her heart would stop growing. Instead, she had just handed the world the shovel to bury her. She reached out and grabbed the phone. She scrolled past the insults until she found a local news site. The headline read, "Local socialite identified in viral park meltdown." Below it was a picture of her face, contorted and ugly. The bomb didn't just land, it leveled her. Her employer, a prestigious interior design firm, had already sent an automated email. Your services are no longer required. We will send your final check via mail. Do not return to the office. She let out a sound, a small broken whimper that she instantly tried to swallow. Even alone in the dark, she was trying to police her own grief. She stood up, her legs feeling like lead, and walked to the bathroom. She turned on the light and stared. She looked for the woman who deserved the hate. She saw the lines of age she tried to Botox away, the red rims of her eyes, the thinness of her lips. She looked at herself, and for the first time in 2 years, she didn't see the perfect Claudia. She saw a stranger who had lost her way so completely that she was fighting delivery boys in parks just to feel like she existed. Back in the studio, Julian's phone rang. It was his agent, Leo. Jules, tell me you got it? Leo's voice was frantic with excitement. I saw the TikToks. Everyone is talking about the park, Karen. I know you were there for the Heritage Project. If you have high-def footage of that meltdown, we can sell it to the networks for 5 figures. Maybe 6. It's viral gold, man. Julian looked at the screen. He looked at the tear in slow motion. He thought about his rent, 3 months overdue. He thought about the camera equipment he needed to hawk just to keep the lights on. I don't have it, Leo, Julian said, his voice flat. What do you mean you don't have it? You were standing 10 feet away. The card corrupted, Julian lied, his heart hammering against his ribs. I lost the whole afternoon. He hung up before Leo could protest. He looked back at the monitor. He knew he was holding a weapon that could finalize Claudia's destruction, or a mirror that could show her who she really was. He didn't delete the file. But he didn't upload it either. Instead, he did something he hadn't done in years. He grabbed his keys and drove. He didn't know where he was going until he found himself parked outside a darkened house on a hill, watching a single light in a second-story bathroom window. He stayed there for an hour, the camera sitting on the passenger seat, silent and unblinking. The following morning, the sun rose with an indifferent brightness that felt like an insult to Claudia. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night watching her digital self be torn apart by strangers. By 9 a.m., her doorbell was ringing. She looked through the security camera. A local news van was parked at the curb. A reporter with a microphone was standing on her porch. Mrs. Sterling, do you have a comment on the video? Claudia backed away from the door, her breath coming in shallow, jagged gasps. She ran to the kitchen, seeking the comfort of her cleaning supplies, but when she reached for the bleach, her hand stopped. The smell made her nauseous. The rules hadn't protected her. The standards hadn't kept the news van away. She felt a surge of her old defiance, a desperate, clawing need to explain. I was right, she wanted to scream through the door. He was on the pedestrian path. He was breaking the law. Why am I the villain for wanting things to be right? She grabbed her car keys. She couldn't stay here. She needed to go somewhere where no one knew her name. She went to the garage, waited for the reporter to move to the side of the house, and peeled out of the driveway, her tires screeching. She drove aimlessly until she reached a grocery store on the other side of town. She put on a pair of oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat, her heart racing as she pushed a cart through the aisles. Every time someone glanced her way, she flinched. She felt like she had "monster" written across her forehead in neon ink. As she reached for a carton of eggs, a woman nearby whispered to her friend, "Is that her? The one from the park?" The friend pulled out her phone. "Oh my God, I think it is. Look at her hat. She's trying to hide." Claudia's grip on the egg carton tightened until the cardboard began to buckle. She could feel the heat rising in her neck. She wanted to turn and snap at them, to tell them it was rude to stare, to remind them of their manners. But the memory of the viral video played in her mind, a warning. If she spoke, if she reacted, she was just giving them part 2. She abandoned the cart and fled the store, her vision blurring with hot, stinging tears. She reached her car and sat there, the engine idling, her forehead resting against the steering wheel. She was a pariah. She was the woman the world loved to hate, and she had no idea how to be anyone else. Julian, meanwhile, was resisting a different kind of pressure. He sat in his studio, ignoring the 23 missed calls from Leo. He was obsessed with the footage, but not for the reasons he should have been. He began to edit, but not a viral clip. He began to cut together a montage of Claudia's face throughout the hour he'd spent watching her before the explosion. He saw the small moments, the way she'd adjusted a stray hair on a stranger's child when the mother wasn't looking, the way she'd picked up a piece of trash and walked 30 yards to put it in a bin. "You're not a monster," Julian muttered to the screen. "You're just terrified." He felt a pull toward her that defied logic. He should have been disgusted by her outburst. He'd spent his life filming the marginalized, the quiet, the humble. Claudia was the opposite of everything he valued. And yet he saw the social divide of grief playing out in real time. He knew that the world would forgive a man who sat in a dark room for 3 years but it would never forgive a woman who tried to scream her way out of the darkness her. His phone buzzed. A text from his landlord, Julian, I saw you on the news in the background of that Karen video. If you've got the footage, sell it and pay me. Or you're out by Friday. Julian closed his eyes. The resistance was becoming expensive. He looked at the Karen on his screen. She was currently frozen in a frame where she looked particularly vulnerable. Her eyes wide, her hand reaching out as if to catch herself. He realized he couldn't just sit behind the lens anymore. He had been the one to capture the emotional spark, and he was the only one who saw the subtext beneath the scream. He opened a private investigators database he used for documentaries. He typed in Claudia Sterling. He found an address. He found a phone number. And then he found something that made his blood run cold. A news clipping from 18 months ago. Local interior designer's husband missing, feared dead in charter plane crash. It hadn't been an abandonment. It had been a disappearance. Robert hadn't left her for another family. He had vanished into thin air and the rules of the world hadn't been able to bring him back. Julian grabbed his camera bag. He didn't know what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't let the world finish what it had started. He drove back to the house on the hill. The news van was gone, replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. He walked up to the porch and rang the bell. No answer. He rang again. Go away, a muffled voice screamed from inside. I have a lawyer. I'll call the police. I'm not a reporter, Claudia, Julian said, his voice loud enough to carry through the heavy oak door. My name is Julian. I was in the park yesterday. With the camera. The silence that followed was so thick Julian could almost hear her heartbeat through the wood. You're the one, she whispered, her voice closer now, right behind the door. The one who filmed it. The one who started this. I'm the one who didn't upload it, Julian said quietly. And I'm the one who saw the tear. The heavy oak door didn't swing wide. It groaned, yielding just enough for Julian to slip into the foyer. The air inside the house was different from the humid afternoon. It was chilled to a precise 68 degrees and smelled so strongly of lemon-scented ammonia it stung the back of Julian's throat. It was the smell of a woman trying to bleach away her own existence. Claudia retreated into the shadows of the hallway, her designer loafers clicking hollowly on the white marble. She didn't look like the woman in the park anymore. Her hair, which had been a helmet of perfect blonde waves, was limp and tucked behind her ears. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater that seemed to swallow her thin frame. You have 5 minutes, she said, her voice a brittle thread. She didn't look at him. She looked at the tablet in his hand as if it were a live grenade. Julian didn't speak. He followed her into the kitchen, a cavernous space of stainless steel and white quartz that felt more like a laboratory than a home. He set the tablet on the counter. The screen glowed, reflecting in the polished surface. I'm not here to judge you, Claudia, Julian said, his voice low and steady. I'm here because everyone else is doing enough of that for the both of us. He hit play. It wasn't the viral clip. It was the footage from the 30 minutes before the delivery boy arrived. The camera showed Claudia sitting on the bench. In high definition you could see the way her chest didn't quite expand, the way her breaths were shallow and forced. You could see her pick up a discarded candy wrapper and smooth it out on her knee with obsessive care before walking it to the bin. You could see her watching a young couple walk by, her expression shifting from a mask of ice to a fleeting, devastating look of envy. Claudia watched the screen, her hands slowly rising to cover her mouth. Why are you showing me this? Because the world sees a woman who hates everyone, Julian said, stepping closer. But the camera sees a woman who is terrified of being forgotten. I saw you looking for Robert. The name landed like a shard of glass in the quiet room. Claudia's entire body flinched. She turned away, her shoulders hitching. The 5 minutes were up, but neither of them moved. Suddenly, a loud thump sounded against the front window, followed by the bright flash of a professional camera. Mrs. Sterling, we know you're in there. Give us a statement on the Karen video. A muffled voice yelled from the lawn. The media hadn't left. They had multiplied. Through the kitchen window, Julian saw a second news van pulling up. The siege had begun. You can't stay here, Julian said, looking at the windows. I have nowhere to go, Claudia whispered, her eyes wide with a new kind of panic. My sister won't answer her phone. My neighbors are the ones who called the news. I'm a pariah, Julian. I'm the monster of the week. My studio, Julian said, the word surprising even him. It's in the industrial district. No one goes there. No one knows me. You'll be safe. I can't leave with you, she snapped, a flicker of her old fire returning. If they see me with a man with a camera, it'll be Karen's secret lover, by dinner time. We'll go through the garage. My car is around the corner. The forced proximity wasn't just logistical. It was a collision of two people who had spent years perfecting the art of being alone. As they hurried through the darkened garage and into Julian's battered SUV, the silence between them was thick with unsaid things. For the next hour they sat in the crawling traffic of the city. Claudia huddled in the passenger seat, her hat pulled low, her hands knotted in her lap. Julian focused on the road, but he was acutely aware of the scent of her expensive perfume mixing with the old coffee and dust of his car. They reached the studio as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the brick buildings in shades of bruised purple and orange. Julian led her up the creaking freight elevator. When the doors opened, Claudia stepped into his world, a world of cluttered film reels, mismatched furniture, and the lingering scent of vanilla tobacco. It's not marble, Julian said, clearing a stack of tripods from an old velvet sofa. But it's quiet. Claudia walked to the center of the room, her eyes roaming over the hundreds of photographs pinned to the walls. She stopped in front of a series of black and white shots of a young girl with a gap-toothed smile. Who is she? Claudia asked, her voice softening. My sister Maya, Julian said, his voice tight. She died 3 years ago. The air in the room shifted. The Karen and the observer were gone. There were just two people in a dusty room, surrounded by the images of people they had loved and lost. I'm sorry, Claudia whispered. Don't be, Julian replied, walking to the small kitchenette to put on a kettle. I've spent 3 years trying to keep her alive through these pictures. It's a different kind of cage than yours, but it's still a cage. They were stuck together, the disgraced socialite and the grieving filmmaker, waiting for a storm to pass that both of them knew might never end. The tea was lukewarm, and the studio was bathed in the soft amber glow of a single desk lamp. Claudia sat on the edge of the velvet sofa, holding her mug with both hands as if to draw the heat into her bones. The barrier of her perfectionism had begun to crack, the jagged edges softened by the dim light. Julian sat across from her on a wooden stool, his camera sitting on his lap like a child he was protecting. We are entering the heart of the story. Have you ever felt like you had to be perfect just to keep from falling apart? How do you handle the pressure of public perception? Let's talk about it in the comments. He didn't leave me, Claudia said suddenly, her voice barely louder than the hum of the refrigerator. Julian stayed silent, using the subtext and silence technique he'd mastered behind the lens. He knew that if he spoke, she might retreat. Robert, he was on a charter flight for work. 18 months ago, she continued, her gaze fixed on a spot on the floor. The plane just vanished. Somewhere over the Rockies. They found bits of the wreckage, but they never found him. No body. No closure. Just a death certificate issued by a judge and a pile of legal papers. She let out a dry, harsh laugh that sounded like breaking sticks. I spent months waiting for the phone to ring. I kept his dinners warm for 3 weeks. And when the neighbors started asking when the memorial service was, I realized they weren't asking because they cared. They were asking because they wanted the story to be over so they could go back to their perfect lives. She looked up at Julian, her eyes swimming with a raw, ancient pain. The rules, Julian. I thought if I just followed the rules, if the lawn was perfect, if the house was clean, if the world behaved exactly as it was supposed to, that somehow the universe would owe me a miracle. I thought if I was good enough, he'd walk back through that door. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He thought of Maya, and the 48 hours where he'd prayed until his knees bled, only for the monitor to go flat. You were trying to control the uncontrollable, Julian said softly. I was trying to stay alive, she corrected. But in that park, when that boy clipped my shoe, it wasn't about the bike. It was about the fact that even after all the cleaning, all the rules, and all the perfection, the world still wouldn't leave me alone. It still kept taking. She stood up, walking toward the wall of Maya's photographs. Why didn't you sell the footage, Julian? My agent told me it's worth a fortune. You could have paid your rent for a year. Julian looked at the picture of Maya laughing in the rain, the one he'd been staring at for 3 years. Because I realized I was doing the same thing you were. I was using this camera to keep the world at arm's length. I was filming people's lives so I didn't have to live mine. When I saw you through that lens, I didn't see a Karen. I saw a sister. I saw a wife. I saw a human being who was just as broken as I am. He walked over to her, standing just a few feet away. The space between them was electric with the weight of shared grief. "My sister died because of a freak infection," Julian whispered. "No one to blame. No rules broken. Just gone. I've spent 3 years angry at the air. Angry at the sun for still rising. When you started screaming in that park, I felt like I was hearing my own heart for the first time in a long time." Claudia reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the frame of Maya's photo. She was beautiful. She was a mess, Julian chuckled, a small genuine sound that felt alien in the room. She never followed a single rule in her life. She would have loved you, Claudia. She would have told you to put down the bleach and go dancing in the rain. Claudia turned to him, and for the first time she didn't look for a camera or a news crew. She looked at Julian. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes, the kindness in the lines around his mouth, and the way he held his breath, waiting for her reaction. In the silence of the industrial studio, with the city humming far below, the social divide of grief finally collapsed. The Karen and the ghost were gone. There were just two people who had finally found someone who spoke their silent language. "I don't know how to be the person the world wants me to be," Claudia whispered. "Then don't," Julian replied. "Be the person you were before the plane went down. Be the mess. Be the woman who cries." As if a dam had finally broken, the first real sob escaped Claudia's throat. She didn't cover her mouth. She didn't turn away. She leaned into Julian, and as his arms wrapped around her, the camera finally stopped rolling. For the first time in 18 months, Claudia Sterling wasn't worried about how she looked. She was just feeling. The 3 days that followed were a blur of dust-moted sunlight and the low, steady hum of Julian's editing suite. Outside, the digital world was still screaming, but inside the studio the air had grown soft. Claudia had stopped wearing her suit of armor. She spent the mornings in one of Julian's oversized flannel shirts and a pair of leggings he'd found in a box of Maya's old things. She looked smaller, yes, but for the first time she looked solid. Real. As our story reaches this fragile turning point, we have to ask, have you ever found comfort in the one person you thought was your enemy? What was the moment that changed your mind? Tell us your story in the comments. Julian watched her through the periphery of his lens, but he didn't hit record. He watched her meticulously organize his film archive, not with the frantic, bleach-soaked desperation of her house, but with a quiet, meditative focus. She was giving his chaos a library, and in return he was giving her a sanctuary. "You're doing it again," Claudia said one afternoon, not looking up from a stack of 16mm reels. "Doing what?" Julian asked, leaning back in his swivel chair. "Observing. Analyzing. Trying to find this subtext of why I'm alphabetizing your documentaries." She looked up, a small, tentative smile touching her lips, the first one Julian had seen that didn't feel like a weapon. "Sometimes a woman just wants to put things in order, Julian." "I'm not analyzing," Julian lied, though his heart was hammering. "I'm just seeing you." He stood up and walked over to her, picking up a heavy vintage Nikon from the table. "Here. Look through this." Claudia balked, pulling her hands back. "No. I don't. I'm the subject, remember? The unhinged woman in the park." "Forget the park," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave. He stepped behind her, his chest inches from her back, and guided her hands to the camera body. His fingers were warm against hers, a contrast to the metal. "Just look. Don't think about the rules. Think about the light." Claudia peered through the viewfinder. The world was different here. The cluttered studio was transformed into a landscape of textures. The grain of the wooden floor, the silver glint of the reels, the way the dust danced in a single beam of light. "It's quiet in here," she whispered. "That's the secret," Julian said, his breath ghosting against her ear. "When you look through a lens, you're not in the world. You're the one holding it. You decide what matters. You decide what's beautiful." She turned her head slightly, her face inches from his. The air between them was heavy with the scent of vanilla tobacco and the faint, clean smell of the soap she'd used. The social divide had vanished completely. There was no billionaire's wife, no struggling filmmaker. There were just two survivors clinging to a raft in the middle of a digital ocean. "I was so afraid of being seen," Claudia whispered. "But I think I was more afraid of being invisible." Julian reached out, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I see you, Claudia. And I'm not filming." He kissed her then, a slow, cautious meeting of lips that tasted of lukewarm tea and 3 years of loneliness. It wasn't a movie kiss, it was a collision of two broken things trying to see if they could still hold weight. For a few hours the healing felt permanent. They cooked a meal of canned soup and stale bread, laughing at the absurdity of her eating off a chipped plate while her $40,000 china sat in a dark house on a hill. They shared stories, real ones. Not the Robert was perfect stories, but the Robert forgot my birthday 3 years in a row stories. Not the Maya was an angel stories, but the Maya once stole my car and drove to Vegas stories. They were building something in the ruins. But the world wasn't done with them yet. The break didn't come from a news van or a police siren. It came from a notification. Julian had left his computer open to render a file. He was in the small bathroom, splashing water on his face, his heart still light from the afternoon, when he heard a sharp intake of breath from the studio. He ran out to find Claudia standing by the desk, her face the color of ash. Her hand was hovering over the mouse. "Claudia? What's wrong?" She didn't look at him. She was staring at a folder he'd forgotten to hide. A folder titled, Elmwood Park Karen Full HIDF. She clicked it. The screen filled with dozens of thumbnails. Close-ups of her face mid-scream. Zooms on her trembling hands. The slow-motion shot of the tear. But next to them were files Julian had been working on earlier that morning, files labeled Elio Network Pitch. "Claudia, wait," Julian started, his voice cracking. "That's not what it looks like." She turned to him and the perfect Claudia was back, but this time her eyes were dead. The vulnerability of the last 3 days had been replaced by a cold, crystalline fury. "Karen Full High Def?" she whispered, the words sounding like venom. "Is that what I am to you, Julian? A pitch? A way to pay your rent?" "No. I was going to delete those. Leo, my agent, he kept pushing and you kept filming," she finished for him, her voice rising. "Even when I was crying on your sofa. Even when I told you about the plane. Were you looking for the subtext, then, Julian? Were you framing the shot while I was falling apart in your arms? I haven't filmed you since the park," Julian shouted, stepping toward her. "I swear." "Then why are these here?" she shrieked, pointing at the screen. "Why is there a folder with my name and a price tag on it? You didn't save me from the news, Julian. You just moved the camera closer so you could get a better angle." She grabbed her coat, her movements jerky and frantic. The shatter point had been reached, and the bond was disintegrating in real time. "You're just like them," she spat, her voice thick with tears she refused to let fall. "You see a monster because it's easier than seeing a person. You used me. You let me believe. God, I was so stupid. I thought you were the one person who wasn't looking for a story. Claudia, listen to me." Julian grabbed her arm, but she recoiled as if he were made of fire. "Don't touch me. Don't you ever touch me again." She ran for the freight elevator, her loafers clicking a frantic, desperate rhythm. "Claudia. It's pouring outside. You can't go out there." The elevator doors groaned shut, cutting off his voice. Julian stood in the center of his studio, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in his eyes. He looked at the folder. He looked at the pitch. He had been trying to find a way to tell her story, to vindicate her, but in his obsession with the lens, he had forgotten the person. He had become the very thing she feared, a silent observer of her pain. Outside, the city was a gray, torrential blur. Claudia didn't care. She walked into the rain, the flannel shirt soaking through in seconds. She didn't look for a taxi. She just walked. The rules were gone. The sanctuary was a lie. She stood on a street corner, the rain washing away the last of the soap and the last of her hope. People passed her, some pausing to look, their phones half raised as they recognized the park Karen, now drenched and shivering in the gutter. She looked at them and didn't scream. She didn't point. She just stood there, a broken statue in a real storm, wondering if she had ever been worthy of connection at all. The door creaked open just an inch. One blue eye, rimmed with red and heavy with exhaustion, peered out at him. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice cracking. "I want to show you what the camera actually saw," Julian said, holding up his small portable tablet. "Before you decide to let the world win." The studio was silent now, save for the rhythmic dripping of a leak in the corner and the low, mournful hum of the computer fans. Julian sat in the dark, the blue light of the monitor carving deep lines into his face. He stared at the folder, Elmwood Park Karen Full HIDF. His hand hovered over the mouse. This was his rent. This was the equipment he needed to finally finish the Maya documentary. This was the break his agent had been screaming for. But as he looked at the thumbnails, the frozen frames of Claudia's agony, he didn't see a project. He saw a soul he had helped to strip bare. We are nearing the end of Claudia and Julian's journey. Do you think Julian can ever make up for his mistake? Can love really grow from a viral tragedy? Tell us your final thoughts as we head toward the resolution. Julian realized that as long as this footage existed, he was still the man behind the lens, and she was still the specimen under the glass. He wasn't choosing between a career and a woman. He was choosing between the ghost he had become and the man he wanted to be. With a sharp, decisive click, he dragged the entire folder to the trash. Empty trash? The prompt asked. Yes, Julian whispered. Delete it all. He watched the progress bar crawl across the screen, erasing the viral gold bite by bite. When it was gone, he felt a strange, terrifying lightness. He was 3 months behind on rent, his agent would likely drop him by morning, and he had no idea where the woman he loved had gone in a freezing rainstorm. He grabbed his jacket. He didn't take his camera. For the first time in 3 years, Julian walked out the door without a shield. The city was a labyrinth of neon reflections and cold iron. Julian drove through the industrial district, then toward the upscale hills, his eyes scanning every sidewalk, every bus stop. He went to her house. It was dark, the perfect cage looking more like a mausoleum in the downpour. She wasn't there. He drove back toward the center of town, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Where would she go? He thought about the rules. He thought about the woman who believed that if she just followed the signs, the world would make sense. He drove to Elmwood Park. The park was a ghost of its daytime self. The aggressive greenery was now a tangled mess of shadows, and the walking paths were slick with mud. Julian parked at the south entrance and ran toward the center, the rain soaking through his shirt in seconds. He found her at the bench. Claudia was sitting exactly where she had been when the delivery boy clipped her shoe. She wasn't wearing a hat or sunglasses. Her hair was plastered to her face, and her shoulders were slumped in a way that made Julian's chest ache. She was staring at the pedestrian path, her eyes vacant. Claudia, he called out, his voice cracking. She didn't move. Go away, Julian. You've got the shot. The shattered Karen in the rain. It'll be a masterpiece. Julian walked into her line of sight, standing directly on the path she had defended so violently. He didn't have his camera. He held out his empty hands. I deleted it, he said, his voice raw. All of it. The park footage, the pitch, the raw files. It's gone, Claudia. There is no story. There is no Karen. There's just you. And me. She looked up then, her eyes searching his face for the lie. What? You needed that money. I needed to breathe, Julian said, stepping closer until he was standing in the mud at her feet. I spent 3 years filming Maya because I didn't want to admit she was gone. I spent 3 days filming you because I was afraid to admit that I'm in love with you. I was hiding behind the glass, Claudia. I was using your pain to avoid feeling my own. He sat on the wet grass in front of the bench, ignoring the cold. The choice was simple. I could have a career as an observer, or I could have a life with the woman who taught me how to feel again. I chose the life. Claudia's lip trembled. The rigidity that had defined her for 18 months finally, truly collapsed. She reached out, her fingers cold and wet, and touched his cheek. I'm a mess, Julian, she whispered. I lost my job. I lost my friends. My house is a museum of a man who isn't coming back. The whole world hates me. The world doesn't know you, Julian replied, covering her hand with his. They know a 3-minute clip. I know the woman who alphabetizes film reels. I know the woman who cries for her husband in the dark. I know you, Claudia Sterling. And I'm staying. The choice had been made. Not the pride of a socialite or the distance of a filmmaker, but the terrifying, beautiful vulnerability of two people who had nothing left to lose but each other. 3 months later, Elmwood Park was in the full, vibrant bloom of late spring. The sun was warm, the birds were loud, and the pedestrian paths were busy with joggers and cyclists. A woman sat on a bench near the center of the park. She wasn't wearing white marble loafers or a designer handbag. She wore a simple sundress and a pair of comfortable sneakers. She had a sketchbook in her lap, her pen moving with a fluid, relaxed grace. A young delivery rider on an e-bike zipped past, his headphones around his neck. He didn't see the woman and she didn't jump. She didn't check her watch. She simply looked up, smiled at the breeze and went back to her drawing. Claudia and Julian's story shows us that even in the age of viral judgment, redemption is possible if we choose to see the person instead of the mask. Thank you for joining us for this journey. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe and let us know. What is the one thing you want to be remembered for beyond your worst mistake? A man walked up behind her, carrying 2 cups of coffee and a heavy vintage camera slung over his shoulder. He looked different. His hair was trimmed, his eyes were bright, and he moved with the energy of a man who was finally participating in the world. You missed the light, Julian joked, handing her a coffee. The shadows on the oak trees were perfect 10 minutes ago. Claudia laughed, a rich, melodic sound that made a nearby toddler turn and grin. I didn't miss it, Jules. I was just busy living in it. Julian sat beside her, his hand naturally finding hers. They were no longer the viral villain and the silent ghost. They were a team. The resolution hadn't been a miracle. Claudia's house was still on the market, and Julian was still struggling to build his new business, a studio dedicated to telling the stories of the overlooked and the misunderstood. The world hadn't forgotten the Karen video entirely, but it had moved on to the next distraction. But the victory was internal. Claudia had sued her former firm for wrongful termination and reached a quiet, 5-figure settlement, enough to start over. More importantly, she had held a memorial service for Robert. It hadn't been a perfect event. It had been a messy, tear-filled gathering in Julian's studio, filled with people who actually cared, not people who wanted a story. Julian had finally finished the Maya documentary. He hadn't sold it to a network. He had uploaded it for free, dedicated to the ones who scream in the dark. It had gone viral too, but for its heart, not its hate. Look, Julian whispered, pointing toward the path. The same delivery boy from the original video was sitting on a nearby bench, looking stressed and checking his phone. Claudia stood up. She didn't look for a camera. She didn't look for a crowd. She walked over to the boy and handed him her unopened bottle of water. It's a hot day, she said with a kind smile. Take a breath. The rules can wait 5 minutes. The boy looked up, blinking in surprise. He didn't recognize her without the rage. Thanks, lady. I appreciate it. Julian watched from the bench. He didn't hit record. He didn't need to. He had the image burned into his heart, the emotional echo of the woman she had become. She walked back to him, her face glowing in the afternoon light. As they walked out of the park together, arm in arm, the camera of the world kept rolling, but they didn't care. They had found an unexpected love in the wreckage of a viral mistake, and for the first time in their lives, the subtext was simple. They were finally home.